All right, well, thank you, Scott. Like you had said earlier, I'm an amateur astronomer, and my previous um, livelihood was made in the oil field, in the offshore and inland facilities. It's a design and engineering, and 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 then this research I did right here carried me into a new field, which is astronomy. Anything, uh, and that's how I came across this planet. I call it Planet 7X because it doesn't fit the total jargon that's put on the internet for sure. This started from a white paper report. The Chinese. This report is called the um, the reevaluation of the eastern and western records of a supernova of 1054, and they clearly show that this is a object that moved through different constellations. The object that they saw, the supernova, actually occurred a few months earlier, and that what we had assumed was a supernova is not. It's a very large object that came through our solar system, and they observed it for I think 26 months. And from that, I was able to plot an orbit of it, and it shocked me. It ended up being on Earth's planetary plane, and it crossed Earth's plane twice. And it came in at around the end of August, circled the sun, and exited around the month of March, which is roughly about 150 to 152 days separation. And that 150 to 152 days sounded exactly what I read in the Bible in two different areas. The one about Noah's flood, where it rained for 40 days, and then after 150 days there was a great wind that passed. That after that wind he saw the water recede, which ancient languages failed to give us some of the details because we have many modern words which were not misexpressed in ancient languages. So with that great wind they're saying, I'm thinking that's a meteor impact that hit the Earth so severe that it knocked off actually 71% of our continental crust, and that coalesced into a moon between 300 to 400 years later. And actually the volume of the moon actually equates to the volume of our oceans. And so some of the math here lines up with quite incredible. And this document, it actually also helps prove out there's a little controversy between astronomy and physics. Like for a comet, astronomy says that the tail of a comet is ice particles, and the physicists are saying that the tail is plasma. So you can read the story about Joshua's long day, and it's whenever we run the same model during his time period, you see that Earth is going through the tail of the comet, and if it's plasma, that will cause a 12-hour delay. If it's water vapor, it won't. And exactly there's additional text that says about an hour to 2 hours later was a meteor shower. Well, that's roughly what it would take if an object passed between the moon and the Earth about midway, and it was roughly 7 times the diameter of Earth, between 6.5 and 7.5. that's the time period it would take for it to reach the meteor shower, and for the meteor shower to end, which would be about 1 hour later. And for instance, there's another verification. If you look at Yeshua's sacrifice, it mentions a 3-hour eclipse. You can't have a 3-hour eclipse not on Passover, because the full moon is on the opposite side of Earth, and a solar eclipse about a moon can only give you, I think it's between 7 to 10 minutes long. And for it to be a 3-hour eclipse, it's automatically describing a third object, a very large third object. And you can also read in the text where there was quakes, earthquakes at the time. So there's evidence if we look for it. I was a skeptic about the general topic about Planet X, and I still am for as far as that term going around. But I've accumulated data. I think there's 3 different scientific reports, white paper reports. There's where they sent the NASA and the Pioneer probes. Then there's these biblical incidents, about 10 of them. If we look at this, there's I think 88 constellations, and all of the data is pointing to one, which is Sagittarius, and not just anywhere in Sagittarius, but on the ecliptic. Well, for that level of data to be lining up is next to impossible. It really points to we have a serious problem coming into our solar system. Are you there, Scott?
Yes. You first referred to this as Planet X. Is this the same planet that everyone's talking about, but you're calling it 7X? Is that my understanding?
Yes. Yes, because the parameters are different. It's not 3,600 years. It's closer. If you had to put a number to it, which this is not a stable orbit, it'd be closer to 360. See, if an object is coming to the angle of the solar system, there's hardly any type of debris that would for it to collide with that would cause an issue with its speed. But since this is on the planetary plane and all the moons and planets are potential objects in its way, it has collided with certain planets and moons in our solar system. This one object can clearly explain many of the anomalies that are in our universe. And this is a direct quote from Dr. Harrington from the Naval Observatory. He was the head Mr. astronomer. And I totally agree with him because it can explain it. Now, he had estimated that it was closer to about 1,100 year orbit was what his estimate, because he didn't have enough data. And he had shown that it was clock. He was thinking that it was clockwise in its rotation around the sun, but with the Chinese data, it clearly shows us that it's counterclockwise with a much shorter orbit. And this is this is why I have to name it differently, because the parameters and the qualifiers for this thing is different. We have a very large object, and using I think 3 other Pacific notes and writings of ancient, like one, there was one that in Velikovsky's book, some of the Middle East scrolls had mentioned that during Joshua's time that they saw an object that was equivalent to 50 times the size of the moon. That's their view from Earth. Well, if you take an object roughly 50% of the distance between the moon, well, that object's roughly around 6.5 to 7.5 times the diameter of Earth. And that also gives us the exact qualifier for 3 hours of darkness during Yeshua's sacrifice. I think there's another qualifier, but it doesn't come to mind at the moment, where an object roughly 6.5 to 7.5 would have worked also. So that's what I'm backing this analogy. There's a date given in the book of Revelation 12:1, that alludes to a date because it's given us an astronomical lineup in the sky. It says the moon at the foot of Virgo with a crown of 12 stars. Leo is normally drawn 11. The 12th star is Jupiter. And the word sun there is not sun because you can't see the stars unless there's an eclipse. Okay, that word there is illuminated body, which is most commonly used in Hebrew. That illuminated body is actually this comet-type object. And the model shows that the tail is illuminating Virgo only. As the text specifically says, only Virgo is illuminated, not all the constellations, which the sun will illuminate all of them. But in the model, the tail is only illuminating Virgo because it's on the planetary plane of Earth. And when we go with that date and we reverse the model, it showed that it entered our solar system roughly about 2000. So telescopes should have seen it in 2000. Now, if we reverse it even further than that, we go back to 1992, around December, when NASA went quiet pertaining to Planet X and their space probes that was hunting for it. It places this object exactly between two of the probes, exactly at the same angle of distance between it. That's exactly what you would expect from an engineer plotting the orbit of two satellites from Earth if they knew an object was there. And that was roughly in 1992, December. And so we should have seen it when it reached about 2000. But if you look at what's taken place since 92 or since 2000, since it entered our solar system, this one object would explain the severe weather patterns, the volcanoes, the earthquakes, the fish kills, the overactive sun. And one of the main things it would explain is the magnetic field of Earth that's moving at 12 times its normal rate. It takes usually another magnetic field to influence a magnetic field. And there's just a recent study, I don't have it in front of me, but a university had just made a printed article that, remember that laser finder that they placed on the moon to measure the distance?
Mm-hmm.
The moon has just now been measured at its most furthest point. It went way beyond its ever expected point. Okay, in its elliptical orbit. And that was just documented. They don't know why it went so far beyond its norm. The only thing that can move a moon like that is a gravity body. Mm-hmm. And as I mentioned earlier, there's two other white paper reports. There's one from UL that mentioned that the study of comets, and I forgot how many they've studied, like over 100, I believe, and they found something like, I think 20-something comets where the orbits were disturbed by unknown gravity. This was also confirmed in an independent study in the EU by John Murray. And this is the same area of space in Sagittarius. Sagittarius is the same area where the Pioneer and Voyager probes went. Sagittarius is the same area where the Chinese, the Japanese astronomers, and the Korean astronomers saw this object coming from. There's only 88 constellations. How is it that all the data is pointing to one? We have a real object. It was seen by the Chinese, Korean, and Japanese astronomers. We have a plot of its orbit. Now we just have to figure out when it's going to arrive, but we have all the precursors of an inbound planet, if you clearly look at what's going around us. There's only one common denominator that explains all of this.
Now, I noticed you mentioned supernovas. What in relation is that for those of us that are not into astronomy?
It's well known in astronomy that there's many papers written that there was a supernova in 1054, and this was done probably before the turn of the century, or the previous turn of the century, and there had many articles written, but no one went back to check this one scientist that made the claim that he found it in the Chinese records. And when they went back in modern times, there is 2 papers written on this. He either fudged the numbers, if you wish to say, or his interpreter was bad, one of the two. But this object moved through multiple constellations. Supernova cannot move; it's stationary. It'll always be in the same constellation. So if you look back in the records just a few more months, that's when the supernova happened. But a supernova has never been documented to be visibly seen for 26 months. This has never been, if you look at it carefully. This is a very large comet-type object. And the visual perspective depends on how close it is. It's relative to the position of Earth. You know, if Earth is far away from it, it would look like, just like you look at Jupiter and night sky, but it would be a large comet, you know. But if you're in March at the time or September, when it's coming around, like, for instance, Joshua's long day, they saw an object 50 times larger than the moon. This also explains, remember in Hezekiah's time, it is documented worldwide that the calendars at one point was 360-day years. But during around 700 BC, all calendars globally changed to 365. And if you read the details of Hezekiah's story, you see that, now in the English, it's not interpreted correctly. It says that the shadow went back on a sundial 10 degrees. That's not what the Hebrew says. The Hebrew says it went back 10 steps. Now, the reason why it can't be a sundial, that means that's the east to west motion. That means the Earth would have to stop, reverse, stop again, and pick up speed 3 or 4 times to come back to its original time, because there's no mention of a delay in, let's say it's extended day. But if you use steps and face it south, you will see that the Earth tilted. The object came close enough to Earth. They attract like 2 magnets. They tilt to each other 26 to 28 degrees. And I found this tilt at least 3 times already in history. And that tilt caused the shadow to go backwards on the steps and then forward again. And that moved Earth's orbit slightly outward, giving us a longer year to go around the sun. That's why we went from 360 to 365 and a quarter. And that's documented globally, almost every culture. This is a logical explanation of that.
Because you mentioned the Chinese documents, you're talking about that goes way back, as well as something recent in relation to the white paper docs?
Yes, the most recent was 1054, so that's why it breaks the model of 3,600 years. This is only in 1054 A.D. Now, I found other mentions of this same object in a different period of time. Let me see here, around Joseph of Egypt. it mentions this object came around in the 1400s. Well, what's interesting about Joseph here, let me pull up my data real quick. Okay. We have also a tilt of the earth. Remember how he had a 7-year drought?
Yes.
And, well, we have 3.5-year drought coming in, 3.5-year drought as it's leaving. That's a common denominator throughout history. You can find this multiple times stated in the Bible, even though they don't know what caused it. Many of the times it's this object. There's a object called the Nebra disk. It's the oldest documented symbolizing the star patterns in Europe. It's the oldest, maybe even in the world.
Is that the sky disk?
Yes, it's called the Nebra sky disk, or the sky disk of Nebra. Nebra was a colony that was about 15 to 20 miles southeast of another ancient Miss Observatory in Gothic, Germany. It is my belief that this disk was actually made at the ancient Miss Observatory. When we see it, it's going to look more like a comet because it's entirely too close right now. If this date in Revelation 12:1 is correct, and I have no reason to say that it's not at the moment, because so far all the signs are still escalating. To give you, for instance, someone tallied up, I think it was the volcanoes. No, I think it was the earthquakes for our previous century, and gave an average on what it would be for a year. Well, that average is exceeded in one day now. One yearly average, we're having that many earthquakes in one day. Is there a logical explanation for this? Only one that I can see is an approaching body. There's only one thing that can perturb our moon, our outer planets, comets, dozens of them, upset our sun. All the planets are showing signs of heating up, and as well as the Earth is heating up. That's why you have the crust expanding, and that's why you have volcanoes and earthquakes that are prevalent. We're going through a drought in many areas of the globe. We had significant drought starting at the end of 2012. And guess what? 3.5 years later, that ends up with the date of March 2016 as the Bible is giving. I didn't give the date. I'm just interpreting what they're showing as a date, because they didn't have a Gregorian calendar. The only way they could give us a date was using stars. And to tell you the truth, it's impossible for man to give us that date at that time period. This was given to us over 2,000 years ago. Constellation shifts over about 1,800 years. In other words, during Passover, it would have been Libra, the scales of judgment. Now, in Passover, is Virgo. 2, to get Jupiter there. Jupiter has an orbit of 11 point something years, cycle. Then the moon is 29 and a half days, I believe. But then the tilt of the moon is 11 years, I believe. If you put all these factors together, then you needed to get at least 4 decimal places of accuracy to predict that date in Revelation 12:1. Now, how can we say they did this 2,000 years ago when a 0 and the decimal place didn't exist yet?
I was curious about some of the dates that I had gotten from some of your past shows, Exodus, Jacob's troubles, and so forth. Why would the rotation or its appearance change? Is it because it's affected by other planets? It runs into other things, like you were saying. Why would there be a different date instead of something that comes, the same?
My research is still going on. I publish as I have new information. I'm about to possibly make a video on to better explain that. And I have a key factor there. It was the Exodus. What happened was we have a destroyed planet. If you use Fibonacci sequence of numbers using 3, that basically equals out the spacing of the planets. It tells us we should have a planet where the asteroid belt is. Right now we have a remnant of a planet called Ceres with a bunch of debris. That used to be now scientists would say that's either, there's only 2 conclusions to that. It's either a malformed planet that never coalesced into, or it's a destroyed planet. I lean to it's a destroyed planet, and it was destroyed by head-on collision by an object bigger than it, which was planet 7X. When it came in and hit Ceres, it slowed Planet X forward motion by 1/20th of its normal speed. That gave us 3 days of darkness listed in Exodus and many of the other points in Exodus. Remember the 3-hour eclipse during Yeshua? That's doing its normal speed. The Exodus was 3 days of darkness. It was formed, but its forward speed was slowed down by 1/20th. Then, if you look at the next event, which was Joshua's long day, it was only 52 years later before it came around, because it didn't have the momentum or the speed to carry it into deep space. So once it lost its forward speed, it just turned back around again. The gravity of the sun is pulling it back. So it pulled it back. 52 years later, it came back around. That was Joshua's long day. Then it went on to what Job's trouble. If you read about Job's trouble, it's fiery hail that destroyed his flock and his shepherd. And a great wind from that destroyed a house that his kids were in and killing all of his children. That happened 131 years later. At the same time of Job's trouble was Ruth and Naomi. They had mentioned a serious drought. They had 10 years of drought. Remember, this object is moving slower. Instead of 7, they had 10. Then 290 years later was the difference that King David and Saul had. Saul had 3.5-year drought at the end of his reign. David had 3.5-year drought at the beginning of his reign. That's 7. And the next year after that, it became its normal orbit. Roughly 358 years after that point was the next one that brought us to Hezekiah. So you have a progression. As it's speaking of speed, it took almost 4 trips around the sun before it regained its entire normal orbit, if you want to call it normal. And if you look at, you can tell that we know something plowed into Pluto. It's at a very steep orbit, yet it used to be a moon of Neptune. Then we have 2 debris fields trailing and one ahead of Jupiter. Something was destroyed there. Whether it's moons of Jupiter or something else, but something was definitely destroyed there. They're in groups. Then we have Mars. If you look at the Mars craters, I think 92% of all of Mars craters are on the southern hemisphere. Why is that? Because that lower half at one time was on the, crossed the debris field of planet 7X. That only the lower half of its spherical shape crossed into the debris field. It was much closer to Earth's planetary plane. It got bumped. If you look at the elevation of Mars, a map of its elevation, you see a nice round curvature of a dark blue spot. That's where this planet bumped into it, causing cracks to appear on the opposite side, which is that big cavern. Looks like a scar on it. That was pressure put on it from this side, pushing over to the other side. And now it's at a much higher orbit. Now it doesn't cross Planet 7. The backside of the Moon has 4 times more craters than the near side. The Moon has protected parts of Earth during these meteor showers. That's why there's 4 times more craters on the backside. And scientists have acclaimed. It appears that the meteor showers hitting Mars, that most of it happened within an hour or so, because of the direction and the way that they're overlapped. If we put this common denominator answers many of our mysteries in our universe. Let me just quote a few. It says that every wall on Earth will be cracked. Every wall. It says the Earth will be split. It says a sea shall die. The life in the sea shall die. 1/3 of the life. It says 1/3 of the trees, 1/3 of the grass, and 1/3 of the rivers will be burned up from a meteor shower, basically. It says Earth is hit so hard in on the second event, because there's 2 meteor showers. That CO6 is the first meteor shower. CO7 is the second meteor shower. That it's the size of a fiery mountain that hits the Earth. Earth is hit so hard that it wobbles like a drunkard. Now explain to me how they could visualize this if they didn't even know the Earth was a globe. They didn't even know that America existed, which is 1/3 of the continental crust. Remember, when Earth is going through a meteor shower, half of it is protected and half of it is being hit. The dark half, in March, it's the daylight side that's going to be hit. The nighttime side is protected because the meteors are coming in from the sun, from that side of the sun. And it clearly says 1/3 of trees, grass, and rivers. They didn't have a word for continental crust, but they're describing continental crust. That is North and South America, it's telling us. That's half of the globe. The second event will again hit us, but it'll be on a nighttime, which is 152 days later. And that's on the nighttime side of Earth. Again, hitting mostly America, but also the Fire Mountain hits the ocean. That's the Pacific Ocean. And that's where the seas boil, it says, because of the lava, also the rolling up of the waves, because boiling can also mean multiple tidal waves. But the Bible describes this next event as the worst time in Earth's history. We're taking Noah's flood and many other. That's not the worst. Noah's flood is not. This is going to be. Well, then you better fill your little hat with knowledge on what will occur, what are the precursors, and what to expect, and how to prepare for it. Because you need to be at the pivot point of the tilt. When Earth tilts again 26 to 28 degrees, that means the surface of the Earth from point A to point B, you have that movement of 1,800 miles within 6 hours or so. Well, that's roughly 300-mile-an-hour winds. If you're in an open plain, flat ground, you're looking at 300-mile-an-hour winds. Now, of course, most areas are not flat, but you're probably getting 150-mile-an-hour winds. And that's 90 degrees from the pivot point. That would, if the Bible is indicating that Jerusalem will be this pivot point of tilt, or the Middle East will.
Therefore, if you go 90 degrees from that point, you're looking about midway of South America or midway of Australia. And that's the eastern coastline of America, would be where the highest winds would be. Arctic Circle would come down to Washington, D.C. with high winds. You're looking at things being flash frozen. Remember those herds of mammoths they found in northern Siberia? They had vegetation in their mouth they didn't have time to swallow when they froze to death. They were flash frozen. They were caught in a tilt. It brought them further north temporarily with high winds. They froze to death instantly. Entire herds. Each story in the Bible is not random. They're giving us data points for the final conclusion of the final book. You don't realize this until you run the data. Let me give you some. Okay, we have Noah's flood. That gives us the 150-day spacing, but that was during a year that was 360. Then we have 364 years later, we have Solomon and Gomorrah, where, remember Lot's wife, okay, the man's description was she was turned to a pillar of salt. When in actuality, there were 2 towns that were destroyed. When they got behind protective wall or whatever, one of the towns was destroyed from meteors, let's say, okay, brimstone and fire. Then when she heard the first explosion, she came back from her protective area to look at the town. That's when the second town got destroyed. Remember that meteor that went over Russia just within the last, I think, about a year or so ago? Mm-hmm. And it exploded in between about 7 towns. And it exploded high enough where they only had the concussion. They didn't suffer vaporization. It was like 20 to 30 times larger than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. But it wasn't close enough to the town to vaporize the people. But if it would have exploded closer to the surface, they would have been vaporized. Lot's wife was vaporized, and a shadow was left on the rock face, just like in Nagasaki. So when ancient man came around and tried to describe what they saw, they say, look, God turned it to a pillar of salt. This was during the same time frame as the Tower of Babel. And the ancient Talmud gives us a little inkling of historical records pertaining to this that says the top was burned. Well, how can you burn a brick structure? A stone structure. They said the top was burned. The base was sunken into the sand. That's liquefaction from the earthquakes. Only the middle was left. You can go to Google Earth today, look at the old city of Babylon, view it. Now, that's the mid-kingdom. Travel a little bit south, and you see a moat in a square with a zizzirat, the remnants of a zizzirat in the middle of it. That was the old kingdom mentioned in the Bible right here, the Tower of Babel. And the only way that you have a moat is because the base sank into the sand. 192 later, you get the Joseph of Egypt. That's the 7-year drought and the tilting, confirmed by the Niebuhr disc in Germany. 275 years later, you get the Exodus, 3 days of darkness. And because it ran into series, it slowed down, so now you have this spacing that kind of gets different here. 52 years later is Joshua's long day. 131 years later is Job's trouble. That's the same time as Ruth in the Bible. 290 years later is King David and Saul. That's where you get the Star of David. This was this object, they called it. 358 years later, you have Jonah of Nineveh giving his 40-day warning. Then you have Hezekiah's son, where the shadow is going backwards on steps. And later that evening, you have 185,000 enemy soldiers that were killed actually by meteor showers. that says in ancient texts. 352 years later, you get Hezekiah, where he said the earth was going to be shaken, where riders in the chariots were going to be cast out. This was the exact same time period when Alexander the Great was conquering Tyre. He had built that land bridge to the island, and he was trying to breach the wall, and he had trouble. It says, I think 4 to 5 meteors came. They didn't have word of them, but fiery hail came out of the sky and knocked down the wall of Tyre. That's how he was able to conquer him. That happened during the same time as Haggai. Then 362 years later, we have Yeshua's sacrifice, 3-hour eclipse. The moon's on the opposite side of Earth. The moon's not involved. And the moon can only give you 10.3 minutes of an eclipse. What gives you 3-hour eclipse? A third object. 284 years later, you have the object that Constantine saw. He claimed to be a cross, but they didn't have the cross yet. They had an X in the symbolism of Constantine. But it was our object rounding the sun coming out. It gave a star because it's a comet. It gave a star like a starburst. 395 years later, you get the Mayans and the Aztecs. The Mayans were destroyed by a severe drought. About 90% of the population died. This was the object that they paid so much. That's what they tracked throughout using their calendar. If you use the last notation, which is a Baktun, you get an exact date from Constantine in 312 to the Mayans on 707. That's exactly the period between. One Baktun. 347 years later, you run into the Chinese documenting this in 1054. And 324 years later, we have a painting in 1378 that shows 2 comets. We show a tree snapped in half. We have a meteor shower. We have buildings that are broken because of an earthquake. We have people holding their stomach because of famine. Now, some people say this is Halley's Comet. Well, Halley's Comet doesn't bring meteor showers or earthquakes or droughts. 319 years later, in 1697, we have a German wood carving that shows 2 major objects in the sky. One's the sun, the other one's almost equal to the size. What was it? Then we're fixing to go 319 years later. We come into Revelation. 2016 is the Jubilee. The Messiah returns on the Jubilee. This is the only common denominator that goes across this so evenly and so predictably. On the droughts, the meteor showers, the earthquakes.
So what relation, I mean, in the Bible where it mentions wormwood, what relation would that be to this?
Wormwood is a meteor, a large meteor, just like a large meteor hit the Earth 150 days later, because we're going to the second debris field. Planet X is nowhere around. It's going outward into space. But we're running into the second debris field because it crosses Earth's path twice. Not once, twice. It's on the planetary plane of Earth. So we have 2 debris fields 150 to 152 days apart. The first one is in March. The next one is towards the end of August. End of August or beginning of September, depending on how it falls. Wormwood is a very large meteor. Wormwood is not the planet we're talking about. Wormwood is just a large meteor, the size of a mountain, fiery, which just like a meteor when it's entering our atmosphere, is going to hit one of our oceans, and that's the Pacific Ocean. And it will hit us so hard that every wall is cracked. the earth is somewhat split. That means lava's coming because the ring of fire is moved. It's pouring out lava. The earth will wobble like a drunkard, and our calendar year is going to be changed. We're going to be pushed inward by ways. That's Enoch's calendar, 365 days a year. That's why we won't know the day or the hour. We know that it's September, beginning of the Hebrew month of Tishri, I think. But living during this time, we won't know it because our calendar year has changed. We can count on the calendar today, but it's not going to be the real date when we get into it.
Well, that explains a lot about not knowing the day or the hour.
You see, that day, let me get the correct saying because I'm a little rusty here. That day that's most... See, remember, this is written by Hebrews in a Hebrew culture that knows certain things that we don't know. The Day of Trumpet, which is the first of Tishri, you have to witness the new moon. That's the only feast day that begins the beginning of a month. Therefore, it is known in the Hebrews. No man knows the day or the hour until it's witnessed. Got it? It's known as that day. Because if you read the next passage above that, he says, "For I have no need to tell you because you already know, because it is the day that no man knows the day or the hour." He told, it's like if I told you, I'm going to arrive at your house on Turkey Day. You'd know without me saying what day that would be. Well, that's what he just said. He told them the day. But we will not know when we start to live in this period literally, because our year has changed. So it's a double innuendo.
Oh,
you know what I'm saying?
So you go back, the calendar will end up going back to the way that it was before?
No, that was 360. Enoch calendar talks, which has never been there's no place in the world as a calendar year ever been documented as 365-day year. It was documented globally 360 and 365 and a quarter days. Let me see. That would be 300. I'm sorry. Enoch's calendar 364 days. It's a day shorter. Okay. So so that's, remember, Enoch, he was given seven visions of the future. So this is a future event that we're going to literally have a 364-day year coming up. And that makes sense because the meteor shower in the end of August is not coming from the sun. That's coming from outward, going towards the sun. So it hits us on the nighttime side of Earth. The meteor showers in April or March comes from the daylight side of Earth. Remember how the object comes in and goes around the sun and leaves. So you have two different directions of debris.
Right. So have you kind of mapped out where you think, like maybe the Mexico or around that area where you think there might be an impact?
No, it's probably going to be the ocean. This larger America would be out. North and South America would be wiped out by small meteors. You know, I'm saying small because they're not the size of a mountain, like this one's described. This one's big enough to move Earth into a different orbit. It's going to push us closer to the sun slightly. Therefore, we have a shorter distance to go around the sun, giving us a shorter year. 364 days a year. That's what happened to Hezekiah's time. We were dragged outward slightly. Our calendar year globally in every culture changed from 360, 365 and a quarter days.
Okay.
Now we have an object that explains why it happened. Because you can't say they just didn't know how to count. That's wrong. They have ancient observatories. Okay? They know when the equinox is from year to year because they need to know that for planting and harvesting. Without that, a town would starve. So they kept count. They knew how to count. They knew exactly how long. That's why globally, either that or no one in the world knew how to count. Which one? Does that make sense? No one in the world knew how to count? That's why we have 360-day year? I don't think so. Because within about 5 years, you miss your growing season. You have people starving because they put their seed in the ground at the wrong time. That's why you have ancient observatories to find out when the equinoxes were. Winter's over with.
I have a person who's listening, and they are asking about a Psalms 83 war and these things that have been that they've read about having to happen before these events would occur. How would you answer that?
There's a war mentioned in Seal 4, which is not the end war, which is after the end of the peace agreement, because if you read carefully, Seal 5 used to bother me. Why would the Almighty put, even write a paragraph or a chapter on people complaining to Him? What would be the sense to that? And what it was is that they're complaining to God because they have not been revenged, and they see a peace agreement being written on earth. They say, "Where is our pound of flesh?" He says, "It's not your time yet. Go back to sleep." Seal 5 is a signal to us when the peace agreement is being signed on earth, viewed from heaven. All right? There's a war before the peace agreement. That's why you have to have a peace agreement. You need a peace agreement after you have a war, logically. Correct?
Right.
So after the peace agreement, the agreement's for 7 years, but he breaks it midway. That is the big battle. There is a battle in when Hezekiah is talking about the battle that's coming up right now. You're going to have a battle with right now. ISIS. Everybody's worried. ISIS has rockets now, large rockets. If they get their hands on that chemical weapon supply that Saddam and them brought into Syria and buried, if they put chemical weapons on those rockets and fire it to Israel, that's a mass destructive weapon they just used against Israel. Israel has clear rights to defend herself with its own mass destructive weapon, which would be nuclear. It says in the Bible, it says a scroll, it says like a evil woman was put into a lead container. Well, the Hebrew word for evil fire or woman is also fire, like radiation. Put into lead, and that scroll is a cylinder flying through the air. That's a cruise missile or a rocket, pretty much. Matter of fact, it gives very close dimensions to the rockets that Iran has right now, if you use the cubit measurements that they're giving. And if ISIS launches this against Israel, that will start this next war. And Israel will have to defend itself. Damascus will be a ruinous heap, and they will not stop there. They will stop. They will also take care of the people who are providing them the rockets, which is Iran. And they'll take care of that nuclear facility. Where that nuclear facility is, I forgot the name of that territory. There's an ancient name for it. It's not Persia. There's another area on the side of Persia that's named. It says no one will live there for 1,000 years. along the Persian Gulf region right there, where they got that nuclear facility. Radiation would give a good reason why nobody would live there for 1,000 years. Then when you see this sign in the heavens, around the 40-day warning or so, between there and around somewhere around March 8th of 2016, if we see this sign, remember, this has to be qualified as seeing a sign in the heavens. We know what we're looking for now. It's the sign of Jonah. This is this object. That marks that this next year is a jubilee. Elijah, matter of fact, it's known in the Hebrew custom that the Messiah returns on a jubilee. And he does, and keep in mind the Bible does not specifically say he only returns once more time. Only, it's more than once. He returns at the beginning of the Great Tribulation, and he returns at the end of the Great Tribulation. At the beginning, he's only picking up the bride, and he says it's a remnant. That's not the entire church. That's a subset. And he brings you to the wilderness. Well, wilderness has never been qualified as heaven. But he's bringing you to a place in the wilderness as a place of safety for his remnant, the chosen one. The ones who are in Jerusalem at this time following the Mekrah, because of Passover, you're required to show up in Jerusalem. That's where the two prophets are going to show up. Elijah is going to show up for the Feast of Passover. That's the 15th. He will announce the groom is coming. The groom will return mid of week, mid of night. Exactly on the date given in Revelation 12:1 is exactly 3.5 days after the full moon, after Feast of Passover. How did they know this 2,000 years ago? They can't be that accurate. Then the Messiah will show up for his remnant. Opposite side of earth during that time is being hit by a meteor shower. The ones who are on the dark side, remember it's nighttime, he's taking them and he's bringing them to a place of safety. Two groups. You have the bride, which is 144,000, which is only Israelites, as it's stated, with their family members. Only the males are counted as a family unit. So you're looking at, you multiply that times 3.5, the bride consists of about 500,000. Then you have the bridesmaids. Remember the wise and the foolish virgins? Well, the word virgin in Hebrew would have been maiden. They're the bridesmaid. But only the wise make it. Why? Because the wise have 2 portions of oil, not 1 portion. The foolish have 1 portion. When their first oil is used up and burned, they trim their wicks and they refill their lamps with their second portion. A portion is supposed to last you through 12 hours of nighttime. This night is 24 hours because Earth's rotation has slowed down by 12 hours. We have 12 hours of daylight on this side. Jerusalem has 12 hours of nighttime. So the wise have 2 portions of oil. So when they're refilling, the foolish come in and ask them, can you give us all? I said, no, there's not enough. They have to go back to town. So as they're finished trimming and lighting their lamp, Yeshua returns mid of night, not midnight. Midnight is a modern term. Mid of night means mid of the night. They just finished burning 12 hours of oil, so that's mid of night. And they just replenished. Now they're leaving with the groom, the bride and the bridesmaid. The bridesmaid lights because there's no street. There is no street lights in the ancient Hebrew wedding. So you need the lamps to light the way for the bride and the groom. So the bridesmaids are carrying the lamps. And they go into this place of safety in the wilderness, where they're there for 3.5 years being fed manna and learning the proper scriptures. Then, in September, on the day that no man knows hour, is the resurrection. The dead are first. Remember, the 2 prophets are dead now. They're the first of the resurrected with the other dead. That's the guests to the wedding. Then the living, which is part of the bridesmaid, enters second. And then the bride. The bride enters last. The least are first and the most are last. That's the least knowledge and the most knowledge. He said, my people perish for the lack of knowledge. Then a Hebrew groom cannot go to war after 1 year of marriage. So that feast in heaven is for 1 year, while the Antichrist has the 7 bowl judgments on it. Then when he leaves, he defeats the Antichrist. He goes back to heaven. Now he tells the guests of the wedding, it's time for you to go back to earth. That's the gnashing of teeth. They don't want to leave heaven. But he's telling them, the wedding's over with. You're the guest of the wedding. You go back to earth and take 7 years to clean up the implements of war, to burn the implements of war. The guests make up the nation of the earth. The bridemaid and the bridemaid live in the New Jerusalem, and they govern the nations that are on earth for the next 1,000 years. They will have to follow the mikras and the laws that they've forsaken. The same issues were also there when they were exiting Egypt. If you add up the numbers of the bride and the bridemaid, it equals out to the same amount of people that left Egypt. 2 to 3 million people was what's estimated as the Passover or the Exodus of Egypt. Did they not have elderly and invalid?
Yeah.
Read the text carefully. They traveled for 3 days and nights. The animals, the elderly, everyone. That's a miracle. Because they were revitalized. They felt like they were 20. Even the animals didn't get tired. They traveled day and night for 3 days. They weren't worn out. Remember the two prophets. The two prophets are going to produce miracles. If someone has a cut leg, a amputated leg or arm, and they in front of those two prophets, you're going to see them. You're going to see that limb grow back. You're not going to see someone faking, pushing someone down, and say this is a miracle, and he pushes them down with their hand. No. You're going to see real miracles. You're going to see healings and limbs growing back, organs going back. These people will feel like they're 20-something again, in their 20s. After the feast, you follow the book of Esther. After the feast, you fast for 3 to 3.5 days. And it says that he revitalized you on that last day. You better go anywhere that he says to go. And keep in mind, Seal 4, remember Hitler? What was the first thing? Let me walk you through. This is almost the same scenario. Remember Hitler, he got the brown shirts to vote him in. He told them how good he was going to be as their president and prop up the country and everything. Then once he was in power, he created the Nazis. Then he changed his agenda to a war. That angered the brown shirts that got him in. Then he created what's called the Night of the Long Knives. He sent the Nazis and eliminated the opposition. And what did Hitler do after that? He took anyone that was a burden to the state and annihilated them. The handicapped, the retarded, they all started disappearing. When we have economic collapse here, you got all these FEMA camps, and the elderly can't stand in line for their own food. We're going to have problems.
So what's next? Well, go ahead.
What? Remember Abraham? The Bible says in the end time the whole world is Babylon. What did Abraham do? He walked out of Babylon. Abraham was not born a Hebrew. It was his actions that defined him as Hebrew. Hebrew means to step out of, to walk out of. Any one of us can be Hebrew if we step out of the system, the Babylonian system. Then we become Hebrew. We may or may not be Israelites because that's a bloodline. But we can be Hebrew because we follow an action. He's telling us ahead of time, the whole world is Babylon.
So how do you see this relating to the Jade Helm, the Jade Helm plans that they have here in the United States?
They have to, you can ask any military, advisor or any person in the military. You exercise on ground similar to a real exercise.
Yes.
There is no other reason why they're on our turf, because there's going to be a real event on our turf. They're preparing for economic collapse. There's some talk about a meteor coming in September. I don't see it in the Bible, but it wouldn't surprise me where they make a false one and create some sort of emergency to where Homeland Security has to be implemented. And they're going to come in as your friend, winning hearts and minds to get established. After CO6, the meteor shower that it's talking about, they won't be your friends then, because it's going to be a terrible place on earth. The Bible tells us this is going to be the worst event in Earth's history. That's a pretty bold statement.
So at that point, if you haven't immigrated to Jerusalem, you're just going to have to stay and stick it out.
You have to be there for CO6. You don't have to be there before that. Matter of fact, it almost tells you not to. It says, don't make your trip in the winter or the Sabbath. Well, that Sabbath I thought used to be the weekly Sabbath, but now I believe it to be the yearly Sabbath. We're in the Sabbath year right now. So, because during the peace agreement, put it this way, I don't have a crystal ball. I cannot tell the future. I can tell you what the astronomy tells me of what Revelation 12:1 says. He is actually literally giving us a date using astronomical. Remember, he said the stars and the planets and moons were for dates and seasons?
Yes.
Well, that lineup is a date. That's March 26, 2016. Now, can I say that is going to be the date that the Messiah returns? I can't say that. I don't have a crystal ball. I'm saying that it greatly concerns me because it lines up with everything. Well, that's when the Messiah returns. That's also the same time as Seal 6, the meteor shower and opposite. That means before that date happens, you have to have Seal 5, 4, and 3 happen. Well, if we back up using Daniel's numbers, that gives us a peace agreement happening around January 11th. And a 40-day warning happens somewhere around February to get you the exact dates. And remember, these are estimates because unless we see a sign in heaven, we don't know. We have to confirm all this from what we see in heaven. Therefore, around September, I'm kind of expecting Seal 4 to happen: war, pandemic, disease, famine. But before that, before Seal 4, Seal 3, that's economic collapse. If you wait to, which is the next seal, if you wait till economic collapse, then you cannot prepare food or any supplies for, or any of this. You have to rely on practicing the mikras, the rehearsal patterns. That's the key to this. And the data points that are given in the Bible and the Chinese records and all these other points, the stories of the Bible are not random. The data is preparing us for what to expect in Revelation. And the sequence of events follows the scientific model that is described in Revelation. And that's pretty incredible for 2,000 years ago when they didn't have the science of how planets are orbiting or Kepler's law of the planetary motion, any of this. Even the Chinese didn't have that. But yet the model follows Kepler's law of the planetary motion when they're viewed and where. So as this object approaches, first you see it as a comet, then it'll go behind the sun. When it pops out, the tail will be pointing opposite side because the tail always points opposite of the sun. It will probably look larger than Jupiter does at night when it's that far away. And every time it gets half the distance between us, it doubles in our visual perspective. So it's roughly, let me see here, roughly at 40 days away. When it gets to 20, it will double in size. When it gets where it's about 7 days away, it will be about 50% of the size of the moon. When it's 2 days away, it will be about 3.4 times the diameter of the moon. And then when it's right to the side of us, it could be anywhere from 50 to 80 times the size of the moon when it's crossing Earth's path, because it's going to pass in between the moon and the Earth. When it gets between us and the sun, that causes the moon and the sun to be darkened. At the same time, the tail is pointing at Earth. Earth slowly enters into the magnetic into the plasma tail. It'll take 24 to 28 hours for it to get fully into the center of the plasma tail. Each hour that it goes in, it's losing 4.5 to 5.5% of the energy that's causing it to rotate. The speed of its rotation will slow down. So you get a compound, and it'll be compounded every hour, another 4.5%. So you get, when you're looking at 24 to 28 hours later, Earth comes to a complete stop, just like the time of Jonah. I mean, the long day of Joshua. About 6 hours before it's ready to cross Earth's path is where the magnetic fields start to attract, and Earth's tilt will start. We will start to tilt. It will take about 6 hours for this tilt to happen. That's when the high winds are happening, anywhere from 150 to 300 miles an hour. Now, when Earth stops rotating, there's a bulge of water near the equator, which is called by centrifugal force. Well, that centrifugal force stops also, and your water will start to gravitate more to the north and south pole. So you have less water near the equator and coastal flooding hundreds of miles in, north and south of the equator. As it's tilting with anywhere from 150 to 300 mile an hour winds. The safe place to be would be at this tilt, which is going to be around Jerusalem. Now, as we're in this plasma tail, that's exciting the northern and southern lights. The aurora is going to come all the way down to the equator. And it's going to have massive colors because we're in very thick plasma. The plasma is going to be super excited, so it's going to howl like a trumpet. And the Earth is going to vibrate because it's coming to a complete stop as it's tilting. And when it gets close to us, when it's at our point of crossing our path, you have electrical discharges between the two planets. You have lightning between 2 to 3 kilometers wide crossing between the two planets, Earth and planet 7X. Remember the mythological stories about Zeus throwing lightning bolts and melting mountains?
Yes.
Well, part of that is myth and part of that is factual. The myth is the name. The factual point was this was the planet they called Zeus or Jupiter. And there was lightning bolts tossed at that time. And then as it's moving away from us, about 2 to 3 hours later, Earth is partly correcting its tilt, and that's when it goes into the meteor shower. The meteor shower lasts roughly about 1 hour. Earth travels in its orbit about 8.4 Earth diameters in 1 hour. But because of the angle that planet 7X is crossing us, that is equivalent to 7 times the diameter of Earth, and that happens within 1 hour. As the Bible says, your doom comes within 1 hour. And the tail now, the plasma tail, is now pointing to Virgo, illuminating only Virgo in the night skies looking from Jerusalem, which is the sign that's given in Revelation 12:1. And this is when the Messiah comes for his bride and the bridemaid, as the meteor shower is happening on the other side. He's removing us and bringing us. Everyone else is underground, asking rocks to cover them. Only his people who know the Scripture well enough is above ground, waiting for him.